Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Get Your Public Meetings Back on Track, Tips and Tricks for Effective Meetings. Our speakers today are Supervisor Joe Simidian with the County of Santa Clara and Tom Jux from the attorney from the City of Wildomar and Town of Yucca Valley, also a partner at Burke, Williams & Sorensen. My name is Hong Tran, and I'm your moderator for this webinar. I'm a program coordinator with the Institute for Local Government. And just to share a little bit about the Institute, we are the nonprofit research and education affiliate of the League of California Cities, the California State Association of Counties, and the California Special Districts Association. And what we really do is promote good government at the local level and provide practical, impartial, easy-to-use materials. This includes a variety of online and print resources, trainings, technical assistance, and webinars like this one. We have 5 different program areas. Those include ethics, local government basics, sustainability, public engagement, and partnerships and collaborations. So if you haven't already, be sure to check us out online at ca-ilg.org. Just to go over some webinar logistics, if at any time you do have questions during the webinar, please use that chat box that should be on the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. Type in your questions there. We'll have a comprehensive Q&A following our speaker presentation. So as you have the questions, just feel free and type them in. So we're really excited for everyone to be joining us today. We kind of want to know a little bit about who's on the line and where everyone is from. So if you could take a minute to answer the poll, that will be on your screen in just 1 second. So go ahead and take a minute to answer which of the following best describes you. Are you from a local government, a state, regional, or other governmental agency, nonprofit, CBO, private sector, or consultant, or other? So I'll give it just a second. All right, well, it looks like we have a really good variety on the line. A lot are from local government, cities and counties. Some are from state, regional, or other government agencies. We have some from the nonprofit and private. You can see it on your screen there. All right, well, we're excited to have everyone on the line today. And go ahead and dive right into the webinar. So these are the key topics that we're going to be covering: best practices in chairing a meeting, that includes key duties of a chair, the components of a successful meeting, and how to deal with disruptive audiences and divisive topics. So in terms of public meetings and public engagement efforts, why is this important? Why are we working to engage the public? As many of you know, engaging our community residents really offers a number of benefits, including better identification of community values and needs. So really hearing directly from residents on their challenges and concerns. Also, more informed residents. So residents understand the reasoning behind practices and policies. Other benefits: improves local agency decision-making, so really better outcomes and impact. And then if residents are more informed and understand the why, this could really increase the community buy-in and support. And all of this really fosters faster project implementation, increased community participation and leadership development, and increased trust in local government. The Institute has a number of resources and tip sheets on enhancing public participation that we'll share towards the end of the webinar. But first, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our first speaker, Supervisor Joe Simitian from Santa Clara County, who has served 30-plus years in elected office, who's going to share more about his experience with public meetings. Joe?
Well, good morning, and thank you all very much. Yes, over the years, I've had the opportunity to preside as a local school board president, mayor of Palo Alto, a county supervisor and board president, as a state assembly member and a state senator, and of course in various committee meetings in those 5 different venues. So I've had the moments when I walked out of the room and thought, boy, that went well, and could feel good about it. And I've had those moments when I walked out and thought, gee, that could have gone better. And so over the years, I have gotten to the point where I feel like I've taken away some lessons learned and try to apply those every time I sit down in the presiding officer's chair. Why don't we go to the first slide? I think I would describe the job first and foremost as being I would say either a traffic cop or an air traffic controller. Your goal, of course, is always to keep folks from bumping into each other if you possibly can. And, you know, I remember when I was presiding in the state Senate years ago, I had a young staff member who came to me and said, boy, you're really the star. And I said, well, if I am, that's a problem, because it's not my job as a presiding officer to be a star. It's my job to be a traffic cop or an air traffic controller, make sure that people get from where they are to where they want to go, and do that smoothly and without bumping into one another. So first and foremost, I think understanding that you're not the center of attention, at least you shouldn't be, and it's not about your personal agenda, at least not exclusively. It's about the fact that you've got staff members, you've got members of the public, you've got colleagues at the dais, all of whom want to get someplace, and you're trying to get them all to a good place by the time the meeting is over. So let's go to the next slide. One of the ways I think you can help make sure that everyone is having a good experience is to think of yourself not just as a traffic cop, but also as the play-by-play announcer. And forgive the sports metaphor, but if you take the opportunity, and there are always these dead times during the course of a meeting, if you take the opportunity to share with people what's happening, what just happened, and what's about to happen, you'll find that the meeting goes smoother in my experience. And you don't want to overtalk it, obviously, but if you can keep everyone refreshed as to what's going on, what the rules of the road are going to be as you move forward, then you won't have quite so many occasions where folks are suddenly disappointed or express concern or say, wait a minute, what's happening? Or, gee, that's not what I thought. And what I'm talking about here is just take the opportunity to say to your colleagues, board members, here's where we are. Supervisor so-and-so has made the following motion. It has been seconded by Supervisor so-and-so. The motion requires a 4/5 vote, and we'll be voting as soon as we hear from members of the public. Well, now everybody knows. All right, there's a motion in play. Who is it that's made the motion? What's the content of the motion? Oh, by the way, it requires 4/5 as opposed to the usual simple majority. And by the way, we are going to get to it soon, but we're going to hear from the public first. That's all useful information, not just to your colleagues, but also to staff who are sitting there in the well, perhaps wondering, all right, what's the pace of the meeting going to be? Also lets the public know that you're aware of the fact that they're going to speak. Make sure that they know that they're going to be heard before the vote is cast, whatever the circumstance is. And obviously, the more confusing the moment, the more helpful these explanations can be. And again, if you just sort of keep people informed and refreshed throughout the course of the meeting, there are fewer surprises, there are fewer opportunities for things to go off track, and people will appreciate the fact that you say, board members, it looks like this item is taking a little bit more time than we had originally anticipated. For those of you who are in the room, yes, we will still get to items number 23, 24, and 25, because they're sitting there and wondering, are they ever going to get to our item? If you can think about those things, describe them in real time, the meeting will go, I think, a lot more smoothly, and everyone will feel better about their role in the process. So let's go to the next slide. You know, if you ask yourself, what's the goal of the meeting chair? I think the goal of the meeting chair is to make sure that everybody thinks they got a fair shake, because in fact, they did. And, you know, first and foremost, the question is, were they heard? And one of the things that I've learned, which surprised me, is that sometimes you need to ask each participant in the room by name if they have something to say. because if you lean forward and say, council members, board members, colleagues, thoughts, comments, even elected officials who you would think would be, comfortable leaning in, will sometimes lean back. And not only is that not good for the process, but the part that's really challenging is hours or days later, they're going to say, well, I didn't get heard. So my experience has been that if you can lean forward and look at your colleagues and say, Councilmember Smith, Councilmember Brown, Councilmember Gonzalez, ask them name by name. Councilmember Chu, are you there? Is there something you'd like to share? If you have asked them by name on the record, if there is something they would like to share, then it's much less likely that they're going to feel like they weren't heard. And it certainly, frankly, protects the presiding officer from some suggestion at a later date that he or she didn't include everyone. And again, you may think you've done your job when you lean in and say, comments anyone? But I learned through my own hard experience that you sometimes need to send an engraved invitation to people there at the dais if you want to make sure that they feel that they got heard. And then, of course, there's the challenge of making sure that everybody's point of view gets a fair amount of time allocated to it. I think we could often, all of us recall, the colleague who simply refused to stop and, after 15 minutes says, and my second point is, but I do think, if there's an understanding before the meeting that you're going to make sure everybody gets a chance to talk for 2 or 3 minutes and then perhaps come back to somebody who wants to speak at greater length, fair enough. But as we've all learned, I think cutting a colleague off mid-sentence simply because of time can be a thorny proposition. So having some understanding of what the expectations are, communicating that ahead of time, making sure that everyone feels that they got heard, and again, that they got their fair share of the time is also important to a good outcome. And then the last point I want to make on this particular slide is I think it's important that everybody feels that they can speak up in what I call a safe space. And that certainly applies to members of the public, and how you create that safe space for them will vary from circumstance to circumstance and personality to personality. One of the things that I do that sets me a little bit apart from my colleagues is I actively discourage applause in the chambers. And people think, well, that's a positive expression of support. How could that possibly be off-putting for anybody? And the point I try to make is if there are 10 speakers who come up and they all get huge rounds of applause because they're in favor of something, for that 11th speaker who's opposed, who deserves the right to be heard, he or she may feel a little uncomfortable if there have been these thunderous ovations and foot stomping and clapping and hooting and hollering for the folks who have a contrary point of view. So I explain why I discourage it when there's the first round of applause, and when I say to people, I know you all want to be heard and you all deserve to be heard, and I want to make sure we're creating a safe space for everybody to be heard regardless of their point of view. I can see the heads nodding. People get it, they understand, and for the most part, they respect it. Are there always a few people who, just can't contain themselves? Of course there are. But I think the less it feels like, a football game or a wrestling match, and the more it feels like a business meeting, the more comfortable it is for members of the public who are not used to the microphone, who are not used to the public space, more comfortable it'll be for them to participate. And even elected officials, I hear from frequently who feel like they get bullied on the dais, that they get browbeaten or pushed around a little bit. So if you can create that safe space for them, it'll produce, I think, a better outcome for all parties, and that includes protecting them from the hoots and hollers of the public, as well as from sharp elbows from colleagues. Let's go on to the next slide, please. So, there's a lot that you can't control, but one of the things that you can't control is the level of preparation. No matter how ill-suited or well-suited you may be to being a presiding officer, and I think, some do better than others, just like any endeavor. There are things you can do to make sure that you run a good meeting, and first and foremost among them is to just be extra prepared. To me, that starts with knowing the rules. And this is one of those times when I think the 80-20 rule applies, by which I mean, 80% of the time, you're just going to rely on the 20% of the rules that come up over and over and over again. So if you're saying to yourself, look, I don't have the time or the patience to become a parliamentary expert, which I think we would all certainly understand, fair enough, but ask yourself or ask someone you work with, what are the issues, what are the questions from a procedural standpoint that are going to come up more often than not? I remember, again, when I was presiding in the state Senate, I had a young staff member who, was very complimentary, and I was very flattered. He said, boy, you really know the rules. How do you know all those? And I said, well, I don't really know them all. I know the handful of rules that are going to come up more often than not. And if you at least make the effort to know those most important, most frequently relied upon rules, you're in good shape. And I think people struggle with the fact that different rules apply in different places, but have that conversation among staff and legal counsel and the presiding officer. Do we use Robert's Rules of Order? Is there a set of council or board policies that are of higher authority? In the legislative environment, there's something called Mason's Manual of Legislative Rules. Ask those questions and then make sure you know which rules apply and learn the basics. And then similarly, know the material. We're all busy. There are days when you have more time, days when you have less, but having a substantive knowledge of what's on the agenda will help you guide people through this process. So, maybe the year before you were mayor, you could sit down there at the end of the council dais and sort of finesse your way through some of those more challenging discussions. But when you're the mayor, having a subject matter knowledge of the topic actually helps you procedurally move things along as well. The other thing I would say is wait and listen, and this doesn't mean you have to forego your opportunity to weigh in and be a fully participating member of the body, but I think people expect some deference from the presiding officer, and I think that's fair. But I also think if you've waited and listened, essentially you've given yourself the opportunity to see if you can't synthesize what you've heard, because sometimes disparate comments really aren't all that disparate. You can get your body to yes if you've asked yourself, all right, were there common threads in what we heard from all 4 of my colleagues or half dozen of my colleagues or however many folks were in the room? The chair, with a little bit of effort, usually can find a way to identify that common thread and pull people together. There are often really, more opportunities for common ground than I think we realize. But you have to sit back and you have to listen and then find a way to integrate those seemingly disparate comments. Let's go on to the next slide. One of these things, and it's something we've all struggled with over the years, is the importance of good working relationships. And, some of this is challenging just because we're in a more contentious time. Some of it is contentious because people care deeply about the things that brought them there. But, I've watched council meetings from a distance, and I thought to myself, really? You think he's a bad human being because he's got a different point of view than you do on a height limit or a variance request? So ask yourself, have you fostered a good relationship with your colleagues before you sit down at the dais? What happens at the dais reflects relationships from outside. Have you taken the time to grab lunch or a cup of coffee? Have you asked a courteous question about how they're doing on some sort of personal or professional matter? And the one that I am always amazed at is, have you made public comments that will make it hard to be collegial? If in a moment of pique you've said something derogatory about a colleague that has shown up in the paper, whether it's right or not, it's not going to be very helpful in terms of maintaining collegiality at the dais. So, there are times to bite your tongue and perhaps forego the opportunity to be self-indulgent. And then finally, when we get to the issue of hostile public comment, and let's go to the next slide, please. The thing I would say is, remember, it's not personal. Now, I know people say, well, but it is personal. They made a personal comment and they pointed at me. Yeah, but you're just the woman or man who happens to be in the seat at that moment. And frankly, they'd be saying the same thing about anybody else who held the same point of view. So, this truly isn't personal. It may feel that way in the moment, but remember that it's not. Remember that the folks who are there in the chambers are not a representative sample. Don't let them bait you, which can be hard, but if you engage, you're going to go down a path you don't want to. And the next point I would make is just be open to legitimate criticism that may come your way. You know, we all have off days. If somebody criticizes you or your comment or your behavior, be willing to lean forward and say, forgive me, I didn't realize that I had rushed past you. My apologies. We'll make sure it doesn't happen again. And then don't let it happen again. A simple, I'm sorry, will usually get you a long way there. And then, finally, I would say, handle the public comments with a measure of grace. There's probably something worth listening to, so even if it comes in a rough package, hear it. Be polite, be clear, and be firm all at the same time. Those are not mutually exclusive. If things get out of hand, a recess can be a powerful tool to settle everybody down. Say, colleagues, it may be time to take a few minutes, give everybody a break, bang the gavel, and let everybody take a deep breath. That helps to create the safe space I was talking about. And then finally, on the next and final slide for me, I don't want to walk through each and every one of these tabs, but just, again, understand that the procedural rules are important to understand, at least basically. If you've got a parliamentarian, use them. Be consistent, but don't be too driven by the rules. It's not about the rules. It's about getting a good outcome. They're a means to an end. And a good presiding officer makes everybody feel like they are valued, appreciated, part of the process, rather than someone who is driving a bus full of rules right at them. Why don't I take a pause there? Looking forward to the questions, and I'm definitely looking forward to hearing what Tom Jex has to say based on his experience.
Great. Thank you, Supervisor Simitian. I want to briefly remind everyone on the line, please feel free to type in any questions you have using the questions box, and we'll get to those questions after our presentation. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Tom Jex now, who is the attorney for the City of Wildomar and the town of Yucca Valley, also a partner with Burke, Williams, and Sorensen. Thanks, Tom.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. As was mentioned, I am a public agency lawyer, which basically means if it's a Tuesday or a Wednesday night, and even sometimes a Monday or a Thursday night, I'm usually at a city council or a planning commission meeting somewhere. So at this point, I've attended, given legal advice at probably hundreds of public meetings, and I've been a part of meetings that go very well and are pretty smooth, and I've been part of meetings that are disruptive due to controversial items that are on the agenda. So what I'd like to do is just spend the next few minutes telling a story, really, of a contentious public meeting that I was a part of, and some tips and some strategies that we implemented both before the meeting and during the meeting, which helped the meeting run a little bit better. But at the same time, it ensured that all sides were able to share comments and that all sides could be heard by the decision makers. So if you could go to the next slide. Several months ago in Wildomar, where I'm the city attorney, we had a very contentious development project. It wasn't a Walmart or a football stadium or those projects that you typically think of that would attract a lot of attention and a lot of controversy. It was a condominium project, and it wasn't very large either. It was maybe 175 or 200 units. So there really wasn't anything particularly unusual about this project. It was a normal standard condo project that you see in every community. But what made it kind of controversial was that it was located right on the border of Wildomar and the neighboring city. And so there was a residential neighborhood right next to where the condo project would be constructed. And the residents of that neighborhood, it was all single family homes, so the residents of that neighborhood were very much opposed to a condo project going in, as they termed it, right in their backyard. So they were opposed to things like the traffic that the project would generate, and it was a 3-story condo project that would block some views. And so there was just a wide variety of issues that they were opposed to. And the first 2 public hearings were at the Planning Commission level, and the meeting chambers were pretty full, but not completely full. The audience area in the chambers holds, I think, around 150 or so people, and I recognize that some of you are, probably from very large cities where it's not unusual to have several hundred people at your public meetings. But for Wildomar, a city of about 35,000 people, so having the council chambers full or almost full was somewhat unusual. So the first Planning Commission meeting was emotional. The developer wanted to make some project changes, so we held another Planning Commission meeting, and word had spread a little bit more, and there were more upset people in the audience. But the meeting went okay. But by the time the project was scheduled for the city council, word had continued to spread by this kind of angry neighborhood, who they sent many emails to city council members and staff members, called council and staff, and even mailed flyers to many community members. And of course, there was also just a lot of buzz generated on social media about the project and the upcoming city council public hearing. So given all of these factors, we had a planning commission, 2 planning commission meetings that were somewhat rowdy, somewhat contentious. We had a flood of angry emails and phone calls that staff and council had received. Flyers were mailed out, and then there was this kind of buzz on social media. Given all those factors, we knew that we needed to be prepared for what could be a large and a disruptive audience at the city council hearing, and turns out we were right. We had a very large audience that went even into an overflow area that we have in our council chambers, and so council chambers were packed for this meeting. So I'd like to go through some of the things we did both before and during the meeting, and as I've thought about this over time, I really can't say that any one thing in particular was the key to having a mostly reasonable meeting, but I think it was really just a combination of all of these things that helped facilitate that meeting. So I'd like to give just a couple different perspectives, really. I want to give a perspective of our mayor, and then of our city manager, then of a fellow council member, and then my perspective as the city attorney. So I'll start off with the mayor. So the mayor and I reviewed together the city's adopted procedural rules for running a meeting, which even included some provisions on when the mayor could have a disruptive member of the audience removed. So I think probably the first tip would be review your meeting procedural rules prior to the meeting so that they're fresh in your mind. It was very helpful for us to go through those rules so that it was on the top of our mind. It also, as we went through those rules together and just discussed them, it gave us a chance to go through what I would call some what-if scenarios. So we talked about that there has to be a very high level of disruptive conduct in order to have somebody removed. So in other words, you're going to have to endure and tolerate probably more than you think. So we discussed giving several warnings and not just jumping right into removing people if there were disruptions. We discussed taking a break if things get too loud, if things get too contentious, in order to just give an opportunity to let everyone simmer down and then get back going again. And some of these what-if scenarios didn't happen, but it was important for us to think about them, to go through them together, just in case. And I think it helped us both feel a little bit more prepared for the meeting. I knew what the mayor was thinking. The mayor knew what I was thinking, even from a legal perspective. And so we were both just more comfortable as we walked into that meeting. And another thing we did, the mayor and I worked on a statement that he could read or summarize right at the beginning of the meeting in order to kind of set the tone. And so he and I put some drafts together and brainstormed what to say and maybe more importantly, how to say it. And so he approached it by saying that he wanted to give a few reminders to everyone right at the beginning of the meeting. And for example, so he reminded everyone that the city asks that the audience doesn't clap or cheer or yell, and that we want everyone to be respectful of all the points of view, and that we, meaning the council, wants to be able to hear everyone's comments. And he really wanted to emphasize hearing and being able to hear and listen to what everyone has to say. And so he would say, as part of his kind of introductory remarks, was that the council has to be able to hear everyone who speaks, and if there's yelling or if there's cheering or booing, then the council won't be able to hear what's being said. And so he emphasized that everyone has a right of speech, has a right to share your comments. But in addition to that right to speak, they also have a right to be heard. And so he wanted to make sure that the council can hear all of the comments. And so he said, if you agree with something, maybe just raise your hand in support, and we can see that. Or if you disagree with something, give us a thumbs down, and we can see that. We can see who's in support. We can see who isn't in support of what is being said. But at the same time, we can still hear what is being said. So he really emphasized, wanted to make sure everyone gets an opportunity to share their comments. Another thing he mentioned was, please only address the council from the podium, not from your chair. And then to emphasize that the city has adopted rules on disruptive behavior. The mayor reminded everyone that the city's rules and state law allow the mayor to ask one of the police officers in the audience to remove anyone who keeps disrupting the meeting such that the meeting can't continue. So I think, really, guys, the takeaway there is those comments right at the beginning of the meeting helped kind of lay a foundation. It helped set the tone for what turned out to be a pretty long meeting. But it was helpful to just have everyone kind of understand the ground rules, right from the beginning, right up front. Let's go on to the city manager and the city manager's perspective. So one of the things that our city manager did was work behind the scenes, doing quite a bit to prepare for the meeting. And I just want to point out a couple of things that he did. One is he met individually with council members to discuss any concerns they had about having a large audience and how to handle that. He explained to them all of the preparations that staff had done, and so they could go into the meeting with some confidence and a high confidence level that all possible preparations were handled. And one of the kind of seemingly small things that the city manager wanted to do, but I think in the end turned out to be a really big thing, was he wanted to make sure that all those in attendance had a chair to sit in so that they were settled, and that no one had to stand in the aisle or in the back or kind of in the hallway and kind of poke their head in to try to hear. He really felt that would contribute to a more calm and an orderly meeting if everybody in attendance had a chair and didn't just have to crowd around in the back. So he worked with our building official, he worked with the fire marshal to bring in extra chairs that still met the room capacity requirements. So again, kind of seems like a little thing, but it had a big effect. And he also had staff members wearing kind of city logo or city badge that would clearly identify them as city staff members, and he had them act as ushers, if you will. And so their role was to just help people find seats so they don't have to stand in the hall or stand in the back. And so staff really helped sort of direct traffic so that there weren't just random empty chairs and people standing around because they didn't want to crawl over somebody to get to the seat that's in the middle of a row. So staff really did a great job at doing that, and it really allowed the council to conduct its business. Let's move on to a fellow council member. So probably, I think one of the most helpful parts of the meeting in terms of really lowering the level of disruption, because that came, I don't want to give you the impression this was a perfect meeting. It wasn't. There was definitely some disruption. So we got a lot of disruption really after the council heard many hours of public comments and testimony. And it was at the point in the hearing when council members were now kind of sharing their opinions and thoughts on the project, on the development project, after having heard all of the comments from the audience. And so when one council member was sharing her thoughts and her comments on the project, every time she would say something, certain members of the audience, if they said something that they disagreed with, they would yell or boo or say something from the audience. And finally, one of the other council members, in a very polite and a respectful way and without raising his voice, said very calmly something like this. He said, "Look, your yelling and booing is disrespectful, and we've just spent many hours politely listening to all of the comments here tonight, and we appreciate those comments. And our job is to listen to them and to form an opinion based on what we've heard, and we've done that. But when members of the audience took their turn, one by one, to speak to us, none of us council members yelled or booed. We acted like grown-ups and we listened. And now it's our turn to share our comments, and we expect the same from you." That was kind of a rough summary, and it was very well said, and I think my summary probably doesn't do it justice, but it was probably more the tone and the demeanor that really made a difference. And so I think my point or takeaway there is it's not just the mayor who can make comments or whoever is the chair of the meeting to try to keep order. Other council or board members can too. In this case, it worked. It calmed everyone down, and council went on to give the rest of their comments without any additional disruption. So finally, wanted to give some perspective from city attorney and mention briefly the provision in the Brown Act that allows a legislative body to remove people from a meeting who willfully interrupt a meeting. So you have probably heard of, maybe you've seen or been a part of, a legislative body can quote, clear the room and continue the meeting with no one in the audience if it becomes too disruptive. But in order to get to that point of clearing the room or kicking everyone out, there's a couple things that have to happen first. And so first, the meeting has to be willfully interrupted. And the phrase in the Brown Act says, "so as to render the orderly conduct of such meeting unfeasible." Meaning you simply can't go on with the meeting, and it's impossible to conduct business. So that kind of goes back to my earlier comment that this is a very high standard, and you are going to have to endure and tolerate more than you think. But if the level of disruption really gets that high, then the legislative body first has to try removing just individuals who are willfully interrupting and letting everyone else stay. And if that doesn't work, and order can't be restored by simply removing some or one individual, then the entire room can be cleared and the meeting can continue. But important to note, if you get that far and the meeting room is cleared, members of the press or, again, quote, other news media who weren't participating in this disturbance have to be allowed to remain in the meeting. And once you've cleared the room, the agency can establish its own procedures to let those people back in who weren't part of the disturbance. So one just quick interesting thought about the fact that members of the press or other news media must be allowed to stay. I think that phrase, other news media, is pretty interesting because I bet in some of your communities and at some of your public meetings, you have individuals who attend the meetings and write blogs or use other social media to write about what happens at your meetings. They might even bring a small video camera and record your meetings. So, would bloggers or similar people sitting in the audience who are writing about the meeting, would they be considered, quote, other news media, and therefore be allowed to stay? I don't have an answer to that question. I don't have any case law guidance, but it's an interesting question, and I guess just some food for thought. So just a takeaway on this section of the Brown Act: one, it's very rarely used. Two, the disruption has to rise to a level where the agency just can't conduct its business. So not just random shouts from the audience. Thankfully, in our contentious public hearing, we didn't get to that point of having to clear the room or having to figure out if our local bloggers had to be allowed to stay. So I will end with that. That concludes my part of the presentation. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Tom. So before we get into Q&A, I want to share a little bit more about ILG's resources, but just a quick reminder, please do type in any questions you have for our speakers in the question box. So I want to share more about our resources. As I said earlier, public meetings are a key component of the public engagement process, and there are a number of other ways and things to consider, when thinking about how to enhance public participation. Things like community outreach and how you're really engaging community residents on key issues. Also things like thinking about your meeting format, location, and time. Are your public meetings in an accessible or trusted location? Are they at a time when residents can join? And then also thinking about other methods of engagement. So in addition to things like public meetings, are there other ways to engage your public, such as neighborhood coffees, surveys, or online forums? These are just a few links at the bottom there where you can find more information on our public engagement resources. We also have a Tools for Effective Meetings Resource Center. This includes a number of different tip sheets and resources, including things on chairing a meeting. So a lot of what the supervisor mentioned. It also includes some video interviews that he helped us with a few years ago, so you can find more information on that. It also includes information on enhancing public participation, and again, how you're really thinking about the process. It also includes a section on parliamentary procedure, which includes materials on open government laws. And then there's also a section on technology and meetings, and really how you can think about the role of technology in your meetings, such as surveys and polls. So if you're interested in more, please do visit that resource center. I'm going to go ahead and move on to Q&A now. So again, go ahead and type any questions you have in the questions box, and we'll get to them. So the first question is for both Tom and Supervisor Simidian. What are your thoughts regarding council meeting gadflies, also known as frequent flyers? Supervisor, do you want to start?
Thank you. Sure. I think the one observation I would make about the so-called gadflies, or the folks who are occasionally identified as frequent flyers, is to listen. And in my experience, in a number of different venues, almost always, if you listen often enough, and are probably obliged to listen often, there's something there. The challenge, of course, is if they come and speak at 10 different meetings, 10 different times, you never know when there's going to be something there that really is useful and helpful. So you have to listen all 10 times, and 9 out of 10 times, it may be the same old, but that 10th time, they're going to have a righteous cause, a legitimate issue. And so, as I say, even if you see the same old face coming up and you think, here we go again, you got to lean in, you got to listen. You can't be checking your text messages. And sure enough, 1 out of 10 times, you're going to think, hey, good that I heard that, because it's important to the conversation.
Great, thanks. Tom, do you have anything to add?
Sure. Yeah, I think with gadflies or frequent flyers, what I have seen some elected officials or even staff members do that has been helpful is to sometimes it is helpful to meet with them individually, maybe prior to a meeting, or immediately after the meeting, where uh, and I've seen that be effective when they can just again really feel like they've been heard, that the city or the agency is paying attention, and it's not just all right, you get your 3 minutes during public comment, and that's it, and we're just kind of going through the motions, and we really wish we didn't have to listen to you. But if I have seen a council member or a staff member, grab one of the frequent flyers after the meeting and spend, 5 or 10 extra minutes just after the meeting, standing in the back and engaging them really on, the issue that they have, and that's been, very, very effective. I think for the most part, not always, but for the most part.
Great, thanks. All right, moving on to the next question for both of you. How would you handle a member of the audience who yells from the audience and cites the First Amendment as a right to yell from the audience? Do you want to start, Supervisor?
Well, I think and Tom and I think both hinted at this in our comments, but I think what I try and do is always offer one warning, and then after a clear warning, whatever step you've said you'd take, you need to take it. And more often than not, that works in my experience. To say, sir, I'm sorry, but if you shout out again, we'll have to ask you to be removed from the chambers. And then if it happens again, you have to take the action you've said. The other comment that I would make, though, is it helps in my experience if the way you communicate that is with regret rather than authority or a command or a demand that, you are in charge. And so rather than say, sir, if you do that again, I'm going to have to toss you out, if you say, sir, please, we can't allow that. I really don't want to have to ask you to be removed. Please help me avoid that. And then it's ratcheted down a little instead of ratcheted up. But one warning and then follow through if you have to. That's usually the way I go.
Great. Tommy, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a perfect way to handle that situation. I think a warning, even again taking a break that we've mentioned, and I think if the person chairing the meeting and running the meeting can try to explain that, right, we all have a First Amendment right to speak, and so it's not to say that one person's First Amendment right to speak is more important than someone else's. So if a member of the audience is yelling while someone is at the podium speaking, then you've got competing First Amendment rights. So I think that the chair can emphasize, look, we're trying to hear, we're trying to listen, and that others have that right also. So, and because we've all got that right, we've just set up a one-by-one process where we all get to express that right, but it's one at a time, not all at once.
And this is Supervisor Submitting again. Let me just pick up on that and say, because I think Tom's made an important point, which is, if it becomes about the folks in authority, whether it's the mayor or the council or the city or the county, the folks in authority demanding that someone obey, it's going to go south in a hurry. If, on the other hand, what you communicate is that we're all in this together, and sir, look, I want to make sure you get heard, but I also want to make sure that everyone else gets heard, want to make sure we can hear them, as Tom has suggested, then what's happened is you've just pulled the 200 other people in the room onto the same team with you rather than rally them behind the guy who says, I demand to be heard. So if it becomes about respect for everyone else in the room, not just the council or the board. If it becomes about a common or joint enterprise rather than we shall be obeyed, I think you're going to get a better result more times than not.
Great. Thank you. So I just want to give everyone another brief reminder. Please do put your questions in that question box and we'll get to them. Our next question, how do you see the role of staff in helping to run effective meetings and in dealing with disruptive members of the public? Tom, did you want to start us?
Sure. So, role of staff, I don't know if I have anything. Just basically what I mentioned in my presentation. I think staff, can lay a lot of groundwork behind the scenes, individually, with elected officials, to just talk through all of the preparations that have been made, talk through the item that will cause the controversy so that they are up to speed on all of those issues. So I think it's mostly just kind of the behind the scenes preparation. And then during the meeting, I think just having extra staff members in the audience was very helpful, just traffic control, acting as ushers, and just kind of making sure everybody is seated and is comfortable and, kind of understands the process. We also had people in the audience, staff members in the audience, helping people know where they could get copies of the agenda materials that were on a table. Often you have people, maybe this is the first time that they've ever come to a Board of Supervisors City Council meeting, and so they don't really know what to expect or where things are located. So we had just extra staff members in the audience helping them find where's the agenda, where are the speaker slips that you fill out, and just kind of even just answering those types of questions in the audience. I want to speak, but how do I speak? And I don't know how to do that. And they could, the staff member could show them, okay, we have this form, and if you fill out this form and turned in, and just kind of helping to just facilitate all those kind of thousands of little questions that somebody will have when they show up to a public meeting for the first time and they're not really sure how it works.
And this is Supervisor Simitian again, and let me just say, having been an elected official for 34 years at 5 different levels, I think it's important for everyone to understand and respect their roles, and that's probably another webinar for another time. Elected officials, I think, sometimes stray into giving direction directly to a staff member in a way that's not lawful or appropriate. By the same token, I've observed from time to time that there are times when staff forgets that it's the elected officials who have the policy-making responsibility and authority, and I think that respect needs to be communicated for the different roles during the course of a meeting in order for the meeting to go forward. I have been in circumstances where I thought the elected officials presumed too much individually in an open and public setting to give direction to staff that wasn't appropriate. I've also been in meetings where I've had professional staff who leaned in a way that I thought was not mindful of the fact that they're there to serve the public, but at the direction of the policy-making body. And so I am a little bit protective sometimes of the policy-making role, responsibility, and authority of the folks who actually stood for election and were selected. So I think that's a helpful clarity to keep during the course of the meeting as well as when the gavel goes down. I do think there's an opportunity for the elected officials to turn to either the city manager, for example, or the city attorney or county council or whatever the venue might be, and get confirmation. And so particularly on parliamentary issues, if the mayor is about to say, my understanding that that motion is not debatable and is seeing some frowns from colleagues who want to speak, turning to the county council or the city attorney and saying, the city attorney serves as our parliamentarian, let me just confirm that with her. That can be a useful way to get confirmation that you're not the bad guy, that really is the lay of the land. Same thing if you're going to say, well, gee, I think the reason we can't do that is because, turning to the city manager and saying, let me confirm that with the manager, can provide some weight and authority that's apolitical, we hope, to the veracity of what's just been said.
Perfect, thank you. So it looks like we are almost out of time. We have time for just one last question. What are your suggestions for the member or supervisor who interrupts other members, becomes repetitive in comments, or dominates the discussion without making them feel like they are not being heard? Do you want to start us off, Supervisor?
Well, thanks. Look, we've all had those challenges, and maybe sometimes we've even been part of that challenge. For the most part, that's a conversation that should happen one-on-one, respectfully, outside of chambers. It is rarely a good idea, if ever, to essentially make that statement to chastise a colleague in an open and public meeting. It happens sometimes. People get hot. People care deeply. But for the most part, those are conversations that should happen quietly behind the scenes, with an indication that, look, Bob, look, Sally, I really do want to make sure that you get heard, but this is a growing challenge, and if you get pushed back, say, well, how would you like me to handle it? And ultimately, the best advice I got when I was a newly elected school board member before I was ever sworn in was, you'll be angry, you'll be annoyed, you'll be frustrated with your colleagues, and when that happens, remember that the same thoughtful, well-informed electorate that had the good sense to choose you chose them. And sometimes we're going to have colleagues who try our patience. Sometimes we may be that colleague, but we all got chosen, and we need to have respect for one another in that way. But having the conversation outside of chambers more often than not is going to be more productive than trying to, quote, settle somebody down or reel them in an open and public meeting.
Great, thank you, Supervisor. Tom, did you have anything else to add?
No, I don't think I have anything to add to that. That was perfect. My only thought was it's got to be a kind of a one-on-one private conversation that goes on behind the scenes.
Perfect.
And this is going to sound a little colloquial, perhaps, but in every venue in which I've served, I'm a great believer in having a meal with a colleague. I think it is tougher to dehumanize, demonize, vilify when you've shared a meal and a conversation that's a little more personal. And it doesn't mean that sharing breakfast is going to take two adversaries and turn them into allies, but it just, as I say, it's too easy to demonize people we don't know, and it is harder once you get to know somebody to take that gratuitous pot shot. And I think a little more time and energy invested in that way can be helpful.
Great. Thank you, Supervisor Samiti and Tom. If we were not able to get to your question on today's webinar, please do feel free to follow up directly with me, and I can try to provide some resources for your questions. Before we close out the webinar, I just want to share a few more resources. Again, please visit us online if you're looking for more resources on effective meetings and public engagement. This webinar was part of our 2018 series. If you want to stay updated on our upcoming webinars, please follow us on social media or sign up for our newsletter. The slides and materials will be posted to ILG's website following the webinar. I'll go ahead and send a link out of that to everyone that has registered. And again, that's my contact info there if you have any additional questions. And then lastly, I just want to thank the supervisor and Tom again for your time and efforts on this webinar. Thank you, everyone.